over to you guys.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody. Glad you guys are here and joining us. This is my first time in Calgary. Yours
Me
as
too.
well?
Yep.
So we're excited to be here. Lots of nice people so far, which, you guys, Canada, living up to your reputation. Love it. My name is Jay Clouse. I'm from Columbus, Ohio, in the United States, obviously. Day to day, I run a virtual accelerator called Unreal Collective. But the reason that I'm here is I've been a community organizer in Columbus, Ohio for our startup ecosystem for going on 8 years now. And the ecosystem's changed quite a bit over the last 8 years. And Techstars Startup Weekend, Startup Week have been a big part of that. So joined here by Matt, and I'll let Matt introduce himself.
All right, thank you. So, I'm Matt Helt. I'm the Global Director of Techstars Startup Week. I'm based in Omaha, Nebraska, so I'm the only Techstars employee in the state of Nebraska. I am in Boulder a lot. That's typically where people think of Techstars as being located, is in Boulder, but we're actually truly global. Right now, the program that I run, Techstars Startup Week, is in 65 cities around the world, in 20 different countries. So my primary role is to help organizers like Jay build their entrepreneurial ecosystem, primarily through grassroots event-based programming. So a lot of what that entails is calls with them, coaching them through best practices, taking the learnings that we have from people like Brad Feld, who wrote the book on developing startup communities. If you haven't read that book, I highly recommend you pick it up. He's currently working on his second book, so Startup Communities 2.0 should be coming out, I believe, sometime next year. And so, what we do is we look at it from the approach that community is the most important driver in startup success. Without a thriving community to support entrepreneurs, a lot of times they're operating in silos. They feel that, who can they learn from, can they connect with? And that's really what startup programs like Startup Week is about. Making those connections, fostering the development of startups in your local ecosystem.
I'm curious, I kind of want to get a feel for the room. Who here is an entrepreneur, considers yourself an entrepreneur? Okay.
Awesome.
How about a community organizer? Okay.
Okay.
How many people here from a corporate or a larger business background? Any investors in the room? Okay, cool. Am I missing any large? How about government? Anyone here representing government? Great, okay.
Yep, awesome. So like we said, we really want this to be an open discussion. I know that with Jay and I's background, we could probably talk all day about this particular topic, but I think we want at any time questions from you. We want to make this relevant to your community, the situation you're facing, and hopefully we can answer some of those questions so it helps you out. I think when we talked on Saturday about what are we going to do, we want you leaving this room feeling like you've learned something that you can take back to your community and immediately implement.
So Matt, I'll start with a question for you.
Okay.
Columbus was one of the first startup weeks that Startup Week, the organization, ran. Mm-hmm. Now that you guys are at 65 cities, what do you guys look at to know if a city is a good fit or ready for Startup Week? Yeah,
great question. So for Startup Week, the program is built to operate in pretty much any size community. All the way from extremely nascent, where there's just a few entrepreneurs hanging out, trying to figure out what they should do to grow their community, all the way up to the really super active, lots of activity, lots of money being injected into the ecosystem. So it really is tailored for any of those situations. And what I do when I talk to organizers is figure out where they're at in the evolution of their ecosystem, and then coaching them through that process. These are the fundamental things. So if you're a really nascent ecosystem, we do everything on tracks so that the content that's being delivered is by local experts. We'll have an organizing team who goes out and finds domain experts in the tracks they want to cover. So tracks are verticals. Usually in a year one situation, you're covering design, development, legal, finance, and startup 101. The whole week can take about 25 events, five events a day. And also not only content, but we drive a lot of celebration into it. Celebrating the people who are part of that ecosystem, making sure that they're called out for what they're doing, and really a lot of emphasis on networking, meeting like-minded people.
When you do that initial assessment to see where the organizers' ecosystems are, what type of questions are you asking those individuals so you can get a gauge for that ecosystem?
Yeah, so usually when someone approaches us to lead a startup week, typically there's someone who is seen as a leader in the ecosystem. So I'll just ask, like, what's the activity look like? How many startups are you connected with? Is there any money? In every single community, no matter where you are, from Seattle to Boston, will say there's not enough money. So if you don't think there's enough money in your community, you're in the same boat as everyone else. The only place that can't say that is San Francisco.
Yeah.
So I'll just ask them all those kinds of questions and then see what are their needs? What are they trying to accomplish by establishing this event? And then, we just drive towards making it the most relevant event for their ecosystem at that stage. I don't want anybody coming to me and saying, we want to be like Denver Startup Week, because that's impossible. Denver Startup Week is 280 events with, I think this year they'll probably hit 20,000 attendees. That's not the average event for us. Average is 25 events with 500 attendees.
That's crazy. So what does Denver do that allows them to have that type of size and scale?
They've just done a great job of growing it over the last, I think their first event was 2012. Their first event, and it's also different in that it's professionally run. So the Downtown Denver Development Group runs the event. That's not really our model. Our model is grassroots. Who are the people on the ground? Those local entrepreneurs who want to give back, who are the government officials that want to be supportive of the startup ecosystem, making sure we make those connections. Anyone who's a stakeholder in the development of that community is welcome at the table. One of the things that we're very intentional about is making sure that it's not run by one individual, one company, or one group. It really takes an entire community to come together and build this event.
Yeah. Yeah.
So let me ask you a question now.
Yeah, sure.
So you've been involved with building Columbus on a local level. What's the most successful things that you've seen in your experience to build that ecosystem?
So this is both the most successful things that I see and also the hardest to keep consistent. I think an ecosystem really grows quickly, as Matt's saying, with velocity of collisions. Collisions is a Tony Hsieh phrase that he used a lot when he was talking about the downtown Las Vegas project. But increasing collisions, and particularly collisions between the founders, it's very difficult to get the founders leading the organization of an ecosystem, because those are really, in my experience, really busy people who are running their teams, running their companies, they're growing that. But if you can, as a community organizer, create the infrastructure or the place where you can aggregate those founders, it becomes really, really powerful. Having a founder-led ecosystem is one of the biggest keys, I think, to continued growth and success of an ecosystem, because there are a lot of factors, and Matt has this one-pager here that has 5 contributing factors to an ecosystem growing, and a lot of it, I think of in sales. They say that on average you have to have 7 touch points with somebody to make a sale. And I think for ecosystems that are kind of up and coming, you got to think of it a little bit like that. You've got to have 7 touch points with somebody talking about your ecosystem. Think of it from an investor standpoint, from the outside, or somebody who may want to move their company to your ecosystem. You've got to get in front of them multiple times. They've got to be hearing about your city before they even consider exploring what's going on there. So in Columbus, we've created this velocity of collisions and also a lot more noise, I guess I'll say. In Ohio, there are several ecosystems that are trying to grow at the same time. You have Columbus in the center of the state, you have Cincinnati in the southwest corner, and Cleveland in the southeast corner. And each of those ecosystems have something that's unique to them that they're doing really, really well. And the momentum that I'm seeing in Columbus, Ohio is crazy relative to those other cities, given all the things that they're doing really well. But in the last 2 years, Columbus has had almost a $1.5 billion exit. In the last couple of weeks, we've had major announcements of companies that have gotten funding from outside of Columbus in San Francisco. Beam Dental is a dental insurance company, and they just raised $22.5 million from Kleiner Perkins. Root Insurance just raised a $51 million Series C from some Valley firms as well. And we're just seeing this velocity pickup. And I think it's from being founder-led and contributing to one another, which in a lot of ways I would also attribute to a very large venture capital firm that started in Columbus about 3 or 4 years ago. And in the last 4 years, or maybe it's 5 years, they've cumulatively created 2 funds of $550 million total. The first was $250 million, the second was $300 million. And they've moved companies to Columbus. They've built companies around ideas. Root Insurance was kind of built around an idea that they had in that company. And that's been really instrumental in growing that ecosystem.
Mm-hmm. So what are some, from the community grassroots level, what are some of the successes and some of the failures you've seen over the years?
It's really hard to continue institutional knowledge at a community grassroots level. Because at a community grassroots level, you're talking about a lot of volunteers. And you're talking about very talented, smart, opportunity-seeking volunteers who are just naturally going to come into new opportunity themselves. And often that opportunity pays. So, you know, as someone who's volunteered a ton of time just in our ecosystem, it can be, at times you feel like it's thankless. It's not. At times you can feel that way and you can get burned out on that. There's always some territorialism between either meetup groups who are doing sort of similar things, but not really, different organizations in town that are trying to put their fingerprints on the ecosystem because they see something coming up and thriving and they want to say, like, I did this. And so as a community organizer, the failures come from if those organizers get burned out and they stop organizing, things really slow down. And if they don't pass on what they know and the people that they're connected to, your ecosystem can really slow down. Because the magic happens when you have someone that's just in place or a team that's in place of volunteers who know the right people in town, and they just make things happen. And they make them happen continuously, and they're pulling in all the different stakeholders as you're talking about, the founders, the investors, government, all these stakeholders getting together at the same time. And it's really hard to keep that continuity without being intentional about it.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that we do with our best practices is someone who wants to lead a startup week for us, we make sure that they don't do it more than 2 or 3 years. If it is a volunteer effort and you're putting a lot of your personal time, you're neglecting your family to do this, it is very worthwhile, but you can get burned out. So we'll teach these leaders to actually groom the next wave of community leaders. So there always has to be this new wave coming through. You can't own it. So we'll stress you can't own the community, but foster it by developing the next wave of leaders. One of the things that we do with Startup Weekend, which is another Techstars program, is called Pass the Beaker. So the beaker is actually part of our logo, and that means being intentional. Who can you identify from your group of volunteers that are helping you with a Startup Weekend that could be that next leader? Because we don't want that fatigue. We don't want people burned out.
That ownership point of you can't own the community is, I've seen it be a threat in ecosystems because a lot of times as ecosystems are coming up from the bottom, the idea to create and cultivate an ecosystem is usually made with good intentions, but can be driven from one investment group, let's say. Yep. And that group has their own agenda. As many good intentions as they have, they do have the agenda of we're trying to invest in some companies. And if they don't invest in a certain startup founder's company, that founder is not going to want to be involved with the event that they perceive as being owned by this firm. So it's really important to keep that autonomy and have those community linchpins that are putting these things together, because it creates this neutral ground that raises the tide for all ships.
Yep, yep. And in my hometown, we have a perfect example of where one group owned the community and everyone just said, well, they'll do it. They'll take care of it. Well, about 4 years into doing this, they disappeared and there was a vacuum, and it really has never recovered. So that's a lot why that we teach these other communities to do this. If you read Brad Feld's book, Startup Communities, that's a point that he really drives home, is that just make sure that all the stakeholders are together. That's why, I'm not here to sell you on Startup Week, even though it's my program, but it really is that thing that catalyzes the entire community, brings everybody together, and shows that it's these volunteers, these grassroots organizers that are putting together the event. If you're an economic development group, if you're a government entity, you play a role in it. You are there to support and help in any way you can. Also, if you're from a university, there's the role for the university as well.
Yeah.
So,
and I come from a university town. Columbus, Ohio has a pretty major American university called Ohio State University, known mostly for our football, but it's huge, and we have a ton of great talent of all kinds that come out of that, and we put a ton of money into research in the Midwest, ton of money into research. Point I was going to make, you were talking about Startup Week driving some of this collaboration. It's, whether it's Startup Week or whatever, it's super necessary just to do that all the time. And there's this sort of playbook I found on startup communities that I really buy into that has a few core components. One being what they call a flag, and this is like a hashtag. For us, it's Startup Columbus. We also use Startup CBus. In Cincinnati, it's Startup Cincy. That flag can be used at all the meetups that are happening organically around tech, around design. If it touches the startup ecosystem at all and they use that hashtag, then you're starting to create this timeline and documentation of events that are happening and who's involved and what's happening at those events. So that's really valuable. Second ingredient of this being sort of a hub, a community hub, a place where these meetups can happen, a place where people can also just go and co-work, a place where there's a cafe and you can just be there working on your own and serendipity happens. It's really great to have that community hub. A third being a regular event, usually at that community hub. And the fourth, which you may believe or not believe, the role was called documentarian. This idea that there's somebody who goes to all of these things and is taking a lot of notes and helping push the flag forward and helping, write about what's happening. Sometimes it's journalists in the local system. But I think of community organizers a lot as like this distributed team of documentarians who really help move things forward and document what they're going and seeing and how you can get involved.
yeah.
Can you talk to these different pieces
Yeah,
that we have on this paper?
So this is a white paper that at the time we were Up Global, and so Up Global about 3 years ago merged with Techstars. But Up Global had Startup Weekend, Startup Week, Startup Digest, which is a locally curated blog or to all the events that are happening in your ecosystem, and then a pre-accelerator called Startup Next. But at the time we did a white paper with Google about what are the 5 key ingredients of a thriving startup ecosystem. And this is, if you go to techstars.com and just search for our white paper, you'll be able to find it. But the first one is talent. And one of the reasons that I brought this to talk about it is so that you can go back to your community and do an assessment of sorts. Look at these 5 ingredients and say, where do we stand on each one of these? It's best if you can convene a group of stakeholders so that they all have input on where you're thriving and where you might be lacking and what you should be putting towards development. Talent is key, so how are you fostering the talent, the next wave of founders, developers, service providers, that system that's going to come in and actually be the people that do the startups. The next is density. Density, we found, is extremely important in a thriving ecosystem. Where are those, like you said, where are those central hubs? Where are the places that entrepreneurs like to go hang out? Where is it within walking distance? Is there good transportation? If you don't have those types of things, how do you get them going? How do you inspire co-working?
Yeah. Think of, let's say, I don't know where all your cities are represented, but let's say you're trying to attract outside talent or outside investment or even founders to come to your city. If they got on a plane right now and were lucky enough to get a direct flight, or if they took the connecting flights to get to your city, where are they going to go to meet the people they need to meet? Do they have any idea? Do you have like a single access point you can kind of point them to and say, this is the coffee shop the entrepreneurs hang out in, this is the co-working space they work out of, this is where the meetups are? If you don't have that, it's just you're creating more friction for these conversations to happen and for growth to happen. Yeah, sorry to interrupt.
Third piece is culture. What is the local culture? You'll see that it's kind of a range where if you start on the West Coast, in the Bay Area specifically, the culture supports risk. If you have 3 startups that fail, you'll be embraced. People won't think anything of it. They're like, okay, fail fast. What's your next thing you're going to work on? As you work east or even towards Asia and Southeast Asia, there's a culture in a lot of those communities where risk is not allowed at all. If you fail once, you're done. So they don't want to fail. We have to actually change that narrative where failure is okay when it comes to this. Assessing how are people in our community willing to take those risks? Are they willing to take their idea that they've scratched down on a piece of paper and actually turn it into a business? And what you'll find is when you start to put these support mechanisms into place, they're more likely to take that risk. They're going to jump off and start something. So you got to create that kind of landing pad so that if they do fail, you're going to say, okay, we're here to support you. We'll help you get through this.
When you talk about that culture of failure not being accepted in some places, do you see that coming from people's families, their peers? I'm guessing investors for sure.
Yep, it's culture-wide. A lot of it is through family. They're just not willing to take the risk because it could shame the family. So there's a lot of work to be done. But a lot of those communities are working with Techstars, and we're going in and showing them that being a founder is a viable option, and there is this support network. Failure doesn't mean your failure as a person; it just means the business idea didn't work. So, fourth piece is capital. Like I mentioned at the beginning. Everyone thinks that there's not enough capital, but what you need to do in most situations is just, if you build it, they will come. If you build startups that are successful, the money will come. And especially if you can attach your ecosystem to a broader network. Whether that, Techstars, we are the worldwide network that helps entrepreneurs succeed. That means that we have people in places all around the world. If there's something that you need and you're part of our network, we have 1 degree of separation and we'll connect you. So if you can get your community, and it doesn't have to be Techstars, it can be any number of networks. It was something I can touch on later as well.
This is a point that, this is a conversation that it just happens in all, we'll call it Midwestern cities, because that's what I'm used to. I'm currently working on a podcast, and we talk to entrepreneurs outside of Silicon Valley. And after we stop recording, we ask every founder, we say, what are the realities of raising capital in the Midwest? And they all speak to conservatism. And that's true. And that's a culture of still being kind of downplaying the risk. Most Midwest investors haven't taken a big shot at a B2C company like Facebook where you just don't know initially what the model is, but you're saying there's crazy engagement and there's crazy growth potential here. We'll just have to figure out how to monetize it later. Midwest investors aren't used to doing that. I can name one of those companies in Columbus, Ohio right now. But what bothers me and what some founders will say about this as well is the key to getting capital, even if your ecosystem doesn't have a ton of capital, is to build an incredible company. And I know that can be hard when at the beginning you think it's an incredible idea and you need traction, but to get traction you feel like you need the initial capital to build an MVP or do something. There are always ways to get scrappier, whether it's bootstrapping by working directly with a first customer to help fund their creation, whether it's prototyping with Photoshop to get initial POs from customers. You know, the capital problem is not going to go away. So I think it's important for entrepreneurs in your ecosystem to think in terms of, how do I build a business that's worthy of capital so that if I don't get it here, I can get investment from outside investors, which we're seeing in Midwestern cities all the time now. Is money is coming in from places where it is a little bit more capital rich, like the Valley, like New York.
Yep. And then the last piece is regulations. So what's the regulatory environment like in your community, so that, you know, a lot of communities that we've seen outside of the States, it's next to impossible to start up a business. It takes so much upfront cash to get a license. So how do you remove those obstacles? How can you make it more startup friendly, more entrepreneurial friendly? The government can support a lot of different things, not just regulations, but creating those central hubs. One of the really cool things that I've seen throughout my travels is in Amman, Jordan. The government actually built this entire facility, and it's surrounded on the outside by these multinationals. I think Microsoft was there, but several of those big, like Fortune 500s, and then right smack dab in the middle was one building dedicated to startups. Very low rent. If you have an idea, you could just go in and create your startup. So we need to see more of that happening in communities.
What communities do you see besides Jordan that do a good job of being entrepreneur friendly from a regulatory perspective?
Tel Aviv, definitely. Tel Aviv is like thriving right now. Stockholm. Where else? I think Vancouver. Anyone here from Vancouver? Okay. Vancouver seems to get a lot of.
And I ask because Columbus, Ohio won a grant from the U.S. Department of Transportation to build a smart city. They want it to be a model for smart cities in the United States and for the world. And we want to engage entrepreneurs. And what we're seeing in smart cities across the world is that the regulatory environment is very difficult. It's very difficult to create. They just don't have in place right now a lot of the regulation that will allow startups to come in and move as quickly as they need to move, because just from a pure time standpoint, oftentimes government procurement takes months, if not over a year, to figure out how and when to slot something into the budget. Someone that I work with at the city will explain his handcuffs as, if he wants to use city funding to buy an HDMI cable, he has to put it out for RFP. That's how restrictive some of these regulations can be. So as a startup, you just don't even have the runway to wait that long of a period of time. So I think this is going to become more and more at the forefront of what do we do as cities to foster entrepreneurship, because if we want entrepreneurs to help us figure out some of the problems that we have by enabling them with open data, which is a lot of what these cities are doing. They're saying, we're not technologists at our core, but we can give you open data to let you build smart applications to improve our city. But if you aren't fostering entrepreneurship with your regulation, it just won't happen. So I think this is going to come up more and more in cities. Because the places that we see doing it well are places like Dubai, where like the regulation is just kind of, someone says you can do that.
Yeah. Yeah, which is good and bad, but yeah. Okay. We're at about a half hour here, and I want to leave plenty of time for questions. There's just 4 things I want to cover really quickly, and then we can open it up. First of all is network over hierarchy. So really what that means is, how is the network? How can you empower your community to do the things it needs to do rather than seek permission? So a lot of times if it is an organization that runs it, that'll slow things down. Instead, create the conditions that empower the community to do what they need to do, to self-run everything, and be a really strong network and not have to ask permission. Second is it's really in the hands of your grassroots supporters. Obviously, you have a role to play if you're that ecosystem builder. Reach out across to all the other stakeholders. Get them involved. Hopefully you have a lot of passion about this and you can get others hooked. But it starts with that grassroots support.
Because as you're saying, if it's not grassroots and you have an organization that's taking things on and doing it on their own, one, you run the risk of that ownership conflict that I was mentioning earlier, but this void that you're speaking to is a serious problem that can happen in ecosystems. You lose institutional knowledge and you lose just anybody moving things forward if it's one organization pushing it forward and they decide to stop that initiative for whatever reason.
Third thing, connect the nodes. So one of the things that you'll see is when you let the network take care of itself, when you have it supported by grassroots organizers, you'll start to see all these nodes connect each other. Because if you kind of take away this agenda, so this group over here that's running something isn't mad at this group over here. Instead, it really is the entire community coming together to build something. So we've seen a lot of success with that. I don't know if in Columbus,
Yeah, I mean, we see a lot of collaboration. Columbus's mantra is smart and open, is what we say all the time. And from something that we do as a community that's really, really strong, that's helped us a lot, is we are really strong with public-private partnerships. There's a lot that the city themselves will partner with private industry to do, which is why we won that Smart City grant, frankly. There were 78 cities that applied. It was a $50 million stake for the Smart City grant. What Columbus did that pushed us over the edge was we raised $90 million in committed capital and initiatives from the private sector that said, if we win this grant, it also unlocks this $90 million. And so now that $50 million isn't just coming from USDOT, now we have this matching commitment where AEP, the American Electric Power, is updating their grid system to allow for more smart infrastructure in the city. And there's actually a coalition in Columbus called the Columbus Partnership that is the chief executive officers of the largest companies in town, the largest corporations in town. And something like 8 years ago, they put together this initiative called Columbus 2020, where they laid out all of these goals for the city of Columbus in the year 2020. And they said, we're putting this on our back as a coalition of private companies to get Columbus these goals. It's job growth goals, it's population goals, it was a lot of economic development. And we're seeing now, 8 years in, that those things are starting to topple over, and it's because the partnership works so closely with the city.
Okay. The last thing that I'll talk about is collaborate versus competition. So like you mentioned, a lot of those groups collaborating within Columbus, but also look at collaborating with other communities. I've seen, and correct me if I'm wrong, but some of the things that I've seen in the ecosystems in Canada is that a lot of groups are competing for dollars. And what that does is it creates a we're better than this community type of atmosphere. Instead, change that narrative. If you have to, I know it's really hard to turn down those dollars, but if you can turn them down and instead say, how can we work together? Let's link our different cities, share resources. You're gonna find in 3-4 years a much more like thriving, sustainable ecosystem, and then instead of pitting each of your communities against each other. I see a similar situation with the cities I work with in Australia. So that's just a dynamic that I think,
Actually, now that you mention that, I know we talked about this on Saturday. We had a similar problem in Ohio because there was a state funding initiative called Third Frontier Program. And they would give certain state-funded dollars to different organizations in different cities across Ohio. And that was reevaluated over some period of time. And so we had some of that infighting as well because they were all competing for the same dollars. And that becomes really hard because all of those organizations that are competing for this dollar, they are still people. And so it's hard to keep like personal feelings out of some of this. And if you as an individual representing this organization feel like you've been kind of burned by some other organization or some other organization of individuals, that creates a chasm between those two communities because it's between two people that doesn't need to be there, shouldn't be there.
Yep. Okay. All right, we'll open it up to any questions.
Yeah, I'd love to hear about some of your ecosystems.
Yeah, so I'm interested in this point about sort of fragmentation in the ecosystem and competition or a scarcity mindset around funding resources. And I want to hear your perspectives on what things, besides the social aspect, on a framework or model standpoint, are there things that can align an ecosystem better so so that people have a better understanding of the part they play and the complementarity of those roles with other organizations. So are you using things like Startup Commons or other frameworks to help you sort of define the lay of the land for everyone?
That's interesting. Do you want to take a swing at that? I can say from my standpoint, I think that's where these grassroots linchpins of the community play a huge, huge role, because you basically, and I say you, but I'm talking about me, I spend a lot of time communicating with different key stakeholders of different organizations, whether as corporations or community meetup groups. And I play the role of mediator a lot. I find myself just being Switzerland in these ecosystems a lot, and putting in very blunt terms, like the way that I see their roles, and saying, you know, you don't have to be competing with this. You guys want the same things. And being that third party voice really helps. As far as a framework goes, I'm not sure. Do you have any?
Well, what I would say, and I know I've said this several times already, get Brad Feld's book, Startup Communities. Buy 20 copies, and you can actually just email me, and I can get them for you at cost. And give them to all the stakeholders and say, please read this. This outlines what your role is. Take it seriously, and if we all do this, we can build a really successful ecosystem.
Because especially early on in an ecosystem's growth, I think it comes very much down to at the individual level. Until you start having this snowballing effect of this company was started, it got some funding, it had an exit, and it threw off people who are now angels who have left that scarcity mindset or in more of an abundant mindset. Until that cycle starts happening, you have to convince these people that success in that community is not a zero-sum game, and that they can all help each other do that. And I think people logically will understand that, but they have to trust the person speaking to them, and then, you know, dip their toes in that water and see that the world doesn't blow up for them.
I'm a startup CEO in the Midwest. Where do you think we go wrong when we hit up investors on the coasts for money? Because on the one hand, you said they'll tolerate failure, and in the Midwest, we really will fight to the last to not fail. Why don't they see the value in that? They want to pick winners?
Yes, but they also, so you know, if you have a lot of runway and you know you're going to fight till the end to try to make your business work, sometimes that isn't the smartest thing to do. You know, we talk a lot about fail fast. So if your idea isn't working, figure that out as fast as possible. If you need to pivot, great. If it's just not ever in the cards that it's going to be successful, shut it down. And I think that's probably the mentality of a lot of VCs on the coast who will say, yes, we'll fund your seed round. This should be enough to get you through a year. Burn through it, spend it, try to get traction. But if you can't, you know.
I think a couple things. One, I think there's still just an inclination by most coastal investors to not invest outside the coast.
Yeah.
They're saying there's enough here, it's close by. I believe in the value of the collisions that happen in this small ecosystem. If you've ever read Angel by Jason Calacanis, which is an amazing book, there's a chapter called Can You Be an Angel Investor Outside of Silicon Valley? And the chapter is one word, it just says no. So I think that attitude exists out there. And the other answer would be possibly just pure fund mechanics. You know, the largest venture capital firm we have in Ohio, Drive Capital, because their funds are $250 to $300 million, for the fund mechanics to work out, your company has to be worth over $1 billion upon liquidation, whatever that event is, whether it's IPO or whether it's an exit. And so if your company just doesn't have that type of ceiling because of the market that it's in, for their massive fund to have the mechanics that work, they're not going to invest.
Yeah, and which is really a shame because like there's so many amazing startups that are out there that are maybe $50 to $100 million a year companies, right? That's the kind of revenue they're generating. But you won't see somebody invest because they want the unicorns.
But angels could be great for them.
Angels. Yeah.
You know, just depends how big that fund is.
You mentioned an initiative in Columbus where some larger companies got together bring those companies together? How did that happen?
Well, it certainly had nothing to do with me. But, I think at the time, one of the largest proponents of that organization, his name is Les Wexner, and he was the founder of L Brands, which has Victoria's Secret, huge retail company. They have a lot of net worth and a lot of sway in Columbus, and they were basically saying, I think, why should we not have more of a say with how our city is being built? Why isn't Columbus on the level of some of these other larger U.S. cities? And what can we do to help push the pedal forward? And it's a model that we see not just through the partnership. There's an organization called the Columbus Collaboratory now, and that is a coalition of mostly the CTOs of the similar companies who are non-competing, but all realize they're facing some of the same cybersecurity risks, IT challenges, and they're saying, let's co-fund basically R&D for these solutions. And I think it's really just a culture in Columbus of collaboration. Smart and open is just our mantra, and we'll often say the Columbus way is this way of communicating with each other and collaborating in that way. I really think it was just a group of people saying, we can have a bigger voice and a larger seat at the table and really help move the city forward if we work together.
I just have two questions. One is, what role have you seen the Ohio State University play in building the ecosystem? And in general, how can universities do better at supporting it as well?
Think Ohio State's huge because Ohio State makes Columbus more of a destination city than probably anything else in Columbus. I think our biggest threat comes from talent loss. You've got 60,000, almost 65,000 students at Ohio State on an annual basis now. And a lot of those students will go elsewhere after graduation. So I think it plays a huge, huge role in attraction to the region of talent. I mentioned that we put a ton of money into research. There's a ton of patented, amazing technology at the Ohio State University that could go towards commercialization. I saw a stat today as I was doing some research that university research technology is 100 times more likely to IPO than just a startup without that. The challenge is, at a university that large, we've been almost bottom of the nation in commercialization of our technology, like near bottom. And the challenge is at those universities, tenure is such a driving factor for how faculty makes decisions. And there is no respect in the tenure guidelines for commercializing of technology. You are incentivized to publish, and once you publish, you can't protect it to the same degree. And even if they did want to commercialize it, often those professors don't want to be the CEO, so now you have to find someone else to come in and actually commercialize it, but work closely with that person, so they have to get along well. It's a really hairy organizational design issue. Was there anything else in your question I didn't answer? I'm sorry.
No, that's great. Thank you.
Great.
All right, we're getting the notice for 1 minute, so I think we could probably do one more quick question.
I have a quick one about Startup Week. So we're coming up to our 5th Startup Week, and we've seen it really grow. And one of the challenges we have is getting people from traditional business industries, not so much the C-suite level executives are really excited. They come out to events. It's getting general employees from traditional businesses to feel like they're welcome and that they don't opt out.
Yeah.
And we've done language audits. We have multiple tracks, and it just any success you've had getting more people to kind of take that first step, even if they don't identify as part of the startup community yet.
I've got some thoughts, but I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, real quick, I think you just have to really hustle to show them the opportunity. I just think it's one of those things, they don't even know, they don't understand the language, so you've done some work into the language. They might be in the mindset that I can only work for a big company. So a lot of it is how do you create those engagement? And it might not be through Startup Week. Maybe it's one of those, Startup Week is the thing that drives a lot of the momentum. But what are those events that you can have that are specifically for people who work for corporates or big companies, that they feel welcome, that they can kind of get a taste of what entrepreneurship is like. But it's hard. It is hard to tease that out.
I think a couple keys. Your location can probably play a part in that. If you are co-located near some of these companies, that can help. If those companies are sponsors of the event, and you're probably doing all these things already, but if they're sponsors of the event, they will probably be incentivized to tell their employees about it. You can market it to them as helping to turn on the innovation engine within their employees and activate that. And to Matt's point, we just finished our 4th year in Columbus of Startup Week, and our tracks now are things like e-commerce and retail, marketing and advertising. You know, they sound less specifically startup focused, and I think it makes it a little bit more inviting to that crowd.